Welcome, Manal. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me on your podcast. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I'm so excited and so honored. As you know, I'm a big fan, and you're such an extraordinary woman. Manal Omar is an author, a world renowned activist, and also founder and CEO of Across Red Lines, dedicated to creating safe spaces for women of faith to understand and activate their leadership role in the world and to really activate their life force. She also has experience as a humanitarian worker and peace builder for over 20 years and has connected with women's rights groups across the globe, as well as having worked with many US government agencies, the World Bank, the United Nations, Oxfam, and Women for Women International. She's also served as an advisor for global figures and a trainer for peace building facilitators worldwide. And she was named among the top 500 world's most influential Arabs by Arabia Business Power in 2011 and 2012, and the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. So that barely, by the way, everyone, barely summarizes what Manal is all about. That is just kind of just the resume version, but she is so much more. And I don't know how you packed so much incredible work and experience and just, wisdom in your life. I think everyone would love to hear about your journey as to what has brought you here, having started your life as a journalist and then worked as a peace builder and then now to doing your own thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think some of the conversations we've had before actually stimulated me to think about that journey as well. And I think the way I would phrase it is like from a very young age, I felt this pull to make a change. And I joke, I feel like my identity, I didn't stand a chance. Like I'm a woman. I was born in Saudi Arabia to Muslim parents who are originally from Palestine. Of all the places for them to settle in the US, they settled first in Texas and then in South Carolina. So I always tease them about missing the memo of immigrants going to coast. So I feel like from a very young age, I've always had to negotiate and explain myself. And I know a lot of people have experienced frustration by that in their lives. I happen to take that and turn it into a career. And so that's kind of the path I went. And there's a concept in my faith, which is called amana, which is entrustment. And it's basically the concept is any opportunity that's provided to you, you have a responsibility to give back using that skill that comes with ease. And so that's something that I think I took really literally. And when I talk about my path, I talk about it as one that started with obligation. So I think as a young child, like of course, I didn't have the words for it, but now I look back, I had survivor's guilt. As a Palestinian, my entire family was suffering. We were one of the few who made it to the US. For immigrants like us, the American dream was a real story. In many ways, it was a real dream come true because to finally find safety after displacement was a huge issue. And so, I took it on like very seriously, like an adolescent would of like, okay, I'm obligated to give back. And that's my time at the UN. That was my time working in the humanitarian space. And along the line, I think that obligation gave way to curiosity. I saw conflict after conflict after conflict. And the very definition of madness is doing the same thing and expecting different results. And that's what we were doing as international community and the humanitarian world, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Libya. Like we had this concept, if we were to give democracy, just everything would fall into place. And that curiosity really just was like, okay, well, how do we do things different? How do we do things different? We can't keep doing the same thing. Despite good intentions, we're creating the conflicts. And I think that was the hardest thing for me to see was peace building is just the other side of the same coin of war. And that shifted me to what I call now, which is the desire and love phase of like, I actually want to see a better world and a different way of being. And I don't want to manage and resolve conflict. I want to prevent it. And that's kind of where I spent the last few years analyzing my experience and being like, what would actually prevent it? And I think, a lot of the studies and research and statistics answer very confidently women. But my experience was that women could be just as violent and often the perpetrators and the sustainers, especially of revenge, So it wasn't just any woman, it had to be a well-integrated woman. And I think that's where I came to understanding the power of women who are integrated and operate from heart space. And it's one of the things I do, whether it's recruiting staff or trying to design interventions and figure out who needs to be in the room. I always say you can't teach heart. You can teach skills, you can teach negotiations, but that heart is a whole different element. So I really identify and recruit those who are in an open heart space to be part of the process, because so many times as negotiators we're taught to negotiate from a place of interest, but that ignores pain and trauma. And that's why Geneva and all these things kept failing, is we were forgetting about the trauma in the room. We were assuming people were going to, go with their best interests, when in reality, that sense of justice was more burning than stability, that sense. And so that's a lot of the work I do by creating Across Red Lines, is help people get back into the heart space. And from there, we can hear, listen, and do dialogue. We jump to dialogue and then we're surprised when it doesn't work, because we haven't created the fertile ground for dialogue to work. And so that's kind of my path. It kind of moved from this sense of obligation to more one of curiosity, to where I landed into a place of real love, where I do this work, where I really believe in human potential for peace. And I don't believe we work against our interests. I believe it's just that pain and trauma that puts us in that place. And how do we actually deal with it holistically rather than piecemeal?
That's a great way to look at this, because what you're basically saying is that so often we're so conditioned to negotiate from our minds, right? And in terms of conflict, and these are serious violations of sacred values, and that's a very
Absolutely.
different thing. And and in any case, I think in any situation, whether it's in peace building or not, or reconciliation, or just day to day, it's the human aspect, I think, that we forget. Again, because we live in the kind of world that does not necessarily value, those are considered soft values that are not, the priority, or not the factor in making a difference in any kind of outcome that people are seeking. So it's wonderful that that's something that you embrace, because it's so important for our times at the moment, and so critical. It's interesting because you also had said to me once about, from this new heart space, and it's not even new, it's our heart space
Yeah.
collectively as human beings, and then really recognizing that interconnection, and how there are so many more commonalities between us as humans, doesn't matter what nationality, race, religion, and to really build on those commonalities and come from there. And is this something that starts to lead us to think of a new social contract,
Yeah.
using love as the foundation for that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I always say, like, you kind of have to think about where we started with the social contract that we have today. And it's funny because it's at least in the US and in the West, it's taught within civic education that, there's this whole, I think it was Thomas Hobbes, and there's this whole
Yes.
monster called the Leviathan that's out there. And I'm sure, people are getting flashbacks of fifth grade history. And, the idea is you give up all your civil liberties because you're getting social services and protection from this monster, this Leviathan. And so fast forward to where the state is 100 years from this philosophy, and people are saying, okay, well, we've given up civil liberties, we're cooperating, we're paying taxes. What exactly are we getting back? And I think especially in the age of the pandemic, it's really clear that there's not a fair exchange here, and people are going to want to balance that exchange. And my hope is that rather than doing it based on fear, which is what the Leviathan is,
Mhm.
what if we were to actually shift from the scarcity model to an abundance model and base the social contract on that? So we willfully share our skills, not from a place of fear that the Leviathan's going to gobble us up, or we willfully share our resources because we know it's a better place to be for us and the environment and the world. You know what I mean? It's a
Right.
very different concept and an underpinning of the social contract. And, before I didn't appreciate the depths of energy and intention. And now that I do, it's really clear from the social, political, economic systems that intention in creation wasn't there. And again, the intention was one of fear. So just shifting it, I believe, could have really powerful impact. And it's a lot of what I try to plant in the dialogues and the workshops that I do is like, what if we just used a different framing?
Absolutely. And this actually really reminds me of the work the Howard Math Institute does, which is really put, instead from a philosophical point of view, really lay down the science that backs heart intelligence and how powerful
Absolutely.
that is. And, so much so that, that heart intelligence actually creates, how do you say, even prior to whatever particular stimulus, our hearts actually know ahead of time
Yeah.
what is coming up and actually gives us an internal guidance system. It's just that often we do not listen to our hearts. So we have our minds, our monkey brains essentially overwhelming that voice. So we default into logic or reason. Not that that's not important, but it's not balanced out with intuition
Absolutely.
and compassion and that open heart space. And that in fact, you can actually measure our heart vibrations in a way that actually show how much it influences coherence in our bodily systems, in our cognitive system, and how we think. And so that we're able to, once we actually come into that heart space, able to be to access more intelligence and more solutions and come to a place of expanded awareness, much more so than if we were just relying on our brain or in flight or fight. So it's extraordinary. Well, what would that look like? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's extraordinary. And one thing that I like to point out, because I think it's an important thing to point out and help us stay in a place of being gentle and kind to ourselves, is that, unfortunately, that process you described, a lot of people who figured it out were the authoritarians and the cult leaders. And
So
so
true.
just like the energy that heals, it's the exact same energy that can kill, just like that doctor has the power to go both ways, just like, the energy that builds can destroys. There's that energy within the systems that exists as well. And the reason why I say that is like the system is designed to overwhelm us. The system is designed to throw us out of heart space. The system is designed for it to be hard to distinguish the higher intuitive voice from that rushed, fast, urgent voice that's panic and anxiety. And I say that because, because it's designed that way, there needs an extra level of consciousness to break through. Like those pop-ups from your phone break the flow of thought that will make you spend 3 hours in something that should have been 20 minutes. And again, it's designed to distract the flow. And
Exactly.
so, I say it as a way just to remind ourselves to be kind. It's not that, our mind isn't, we can't control our mind. It's actually designed to throw us out of balance, which just takes so much more effort and consciousness. And I would add community. In the past, we could go to meditation and realign ourselves, but nowadays we really need support and community in that alignment process. So just my 2 cents from the peanut gallery on the design of the system that we live in today.
No, that's such a valid point, and thank you. And that's a great point, because how do we do that? You bring up community, and how. I mean, I'm really curious, having been in the field so long, in conflict zones, and in the out there in the world where you're talking to global leaders, tribal leaders, and you're trying to bridge conflicts that go back thousands of years, right? How do you then, the thing is, exactly according to what you just said, there is almost a automatic feedback loop that happens, right? So it's like fear begets more distrust, and that just, it's very difficult to break that into the heart open space. So what would it look like for you to actually create that heart-centered space for dialogue, compassion, and understanding?
It's a wonderful question. And one of the things that I think is always frustrating. Like I joke a lot. It's like, I took this time off. I traveled the world. I went to Spain. I went to Bali. I went to understand energy. I spent like this time understanding thing to basically come up with bumper stickers, right? Like it's like the simplest cliches that everyone has always told us, and every religious tradition kind of tells us. And yet, I think the human mind is so desperate not to do the simple that it'll complicate things just to feel more in control. So, what I'm about to share is really obvious, but we tend to skip it. And with it is really meeting people where they're at. When
Mm-hmm.
they're in that place of anger, when they're at that place of revenge, to try and start talking forgiveness and stuff, it is bypass. Like you have to really start with meeting people where they're at, and validating the grievances. Like no matter how violent the conflict, generally there are legitimate grievances on both sides. And it's hard, really hard to kind of, excavate and dig beyond all the hurt and the pain that was caused to get to what we call the root of conflict. And that takes a lot of time and validation and not denying where the person is at. And that includes communities and the collective, like, well, especially people who claim self-determination, like, well, you're really X, and you should just accept that you're X. And a lot of the countries I work with, like they'll be like, no, we're Kurdish, we're not,
Mm-hmm.
Iraqi, we're not Syrian, we want to be seen as this. And that type of thing, when you try to override it and force them into a national identity, like it's just, you can't go anywhere from there. You've what we call frozen conflict. And that's why you see 70 years later, the same conflict going on. It freezes because you haven't met people where they are at. Once you meet them where they're at, you try to bring them to a place of safety. Of like,
Mm-hmm.
it's valid, you're here. Just because you want to call yourself a Kurd or a Palestinian or whatever it is, I'm taking extreme conflicts, but it could even just be inside the home, like I don't want to study, like something like that could throw an entire family off kilter. Like, no, we have no one who drops out of high school. It goes into that realm of like, you just got to meet them where they're at, make them feel safe. I really don't believe in bringing different parties together until they're completely ready. So I'm a huge believer in what we call shuttle diplomacy. So I work with individual parties. And again, it could be a collective. I've done something called police and justice reform before with our rule of law teams. And, if you try to bring the police and the community in the room prematurely, you can't unhear what's heard. And so when the police hear the cynicism and the attacks and vice versa, you can't undo that. So you air it all out separately. You get to the root
Mm-hmm.
of the problem and the recommendation. And the absolute final step is when you bring people together. And when I bring people together, I get them to focus on the second most controversial issue, not the first, because I want them to build muscle memory of trust. So if I were, again, extreme examples helps deliver the point. If I were to bring Israeli and Palestinians together, I wouldn't talk about the status of Jerusalem or even the status of the state. I would talk about how do we educate children and what does the
Mm-hmm.
education system look like. And inevitably you're going to get into the history of creating Israel and the conflict, but everyone cares about educating their children. So it's a muscle memory that will be safe to develop under that framework over something like, you just can't go into something that's so heightened and you don't have a base to agree on and try to create trust. You've got to have the trust first. And like I said, that goes all the way, I use extreme examples of nations, but you can do it on the individual level. Like that could be a part of you that you're rejecting on the shadow level. And I totally have little internal meetings where I bring the conflicting sides of myself and like negotiate and like just do an integration within myself through meditation or prayer. And so it really does go, that skill goes from the, individual to the family, to the community, to the nation, to the world. And that's my goal, is give people more tools in their toolbox to deal with this stuff at every level of conflict.
Amazing, and such a true and valid point. Um, we're talking about as above, so below, right? Everything that we experience outside, it's a reflection of how we are inside. So
Mm,
that process of peace has to start from within.
yeah.
And you bring up a really interesting point about polarity, because we're talking extreme conflict, but in general polarity, right?
Yeah.
And how obviously we are embroiled as a world at the moment in so many extremes, and that seems to be getting sort of more and more exaggerated as time goes by. What I find interesting is that it's no longer, it seems to me at least, it's not so much about, it's certainly not, it certainly is not about who's right or wrong, but it's almost more important to come to that understanding of, okay, building that trust, yes, and actually understanding that no, we don't all have to be the same at all.
Yeah.
If there is peace to be found, it is actually in our uniqueness, right? It is in honoring our differences without having to subjugate the other party under, one particular group's, control or interest necessarily. That
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be a domineering system. It can be a system where, um, you know, you could call it an enlightened self-interest system, where if we're all in this and we're in this together no matter what, because guess what, we're all living the same planet. And if nothing else, the pandemic in 2020 has shown us is how connected we are, right? And on an energetic level, on a spiritual level, that's definitely true as well. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interconnectedness is important. And one of the things that I've really come to realize this year through observing is just how much the universe does interfere for harmony. There's always been a part of me that, again, I live in extremes and war zones and seen some of the worst part of what humanity can do to one another. And in those moments, I'm kind of shocked and just being like, well, where's balance? Where's the universe? And I'm often shown that act of kindness and war, that act of joy that does provide the balance. And I think we saw a lot of that with the universe kind of pushing us into the micro. Like there was almost an obsession of dealing with macro patterns and macro trends and, the big issues that have really destabilized us, structural violence, institutional violence, all of these things have been just at the forefront, I would say, for decades of what we're addressing. And I think the universe was like, this is great. You're heading like finally, because the golden word I would say for macro and micro is accountability.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it kind of pushed us back into the micro, like look in your immediate circle, look at your immediate community, look at how bad you are at resilience. I mean, some other countries that have a lot less resources are bouncing back quicker than the US because we're not built for resilience. We're not built
No, we're
for
not. Mhm.
tolerant, hard circumstances. And this is a humbling wake up call. It's why I'm happy to be here. Most of the time, I'm based internationally. I'm happy to be in my adopted homeland because I have skills to offer when it comes to resilience. But that is been shown as an Achilles heel for the US. Is we don't have a lot of resilience. And so I think that's kind of what's happening is the macro was shown. I'd like to think in the last 2 years that's coming, because I think we still have some time of reflection that we're really looking at the micro, which in analysis coming together towards integration, by 2025, we should have a real view of something different that we've never had before. And like I said, it's been the Leviathan, it's been punishment, it's been the patriarchy. It's like you follow the rules, here's your reward. You don't, here's the lightning. And we're totally changing a new model. So I think there's a lot of excitement that we're going to see in the next few years of alternative systems. But I don't think we could have gotten there unless we went really, really into that micro individual level, which I think is what these 2 years are all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been actually a very powerful time.
Yeah.
And you bring this to another point, which is about embodiment, right? Because until we can embody and in our own selves and internally, until we can actually understand that we don't just need to disassociate from any part of ourselves and come into wholeness that way, can we actually have then more compassion, not so much judgment, more compassion towards ourselves. And that's how we actually have it towards our neighbor. It's
Yeah.
very hard to say, well, it's all in both sides are difficult, both sides are useful. You can come in from external to internal, internal to external. But personally, I've always found that it's a little more futile if we just kind of focus on the external and don't do anything about the internal, that it's so much more powerful if we can actually resolve that within ourselves. And the embodiment of that spirit, right? The embodiment of compassion, the embodiment of that is actually forgiveness of ourselves.
Absolutely.
On a day-to-day basis. And you were talking earlier also about staging, right? You don't want to kind of get to the point that is most controversial when you're dealing with two conflicting groups. You want to go to the second most or the third most and build up. And in the same way, having that patience with ourselves, and I think having that compassion with ourselves to kind of go, all right, you know what, my package was supposed to be done. I mean, this is like so mundane, but like, okay, these
Yeah.
things were supposed to be delivered on time, and now they're like 2 weeks late, and I'm so frustrated, and I blame so and so and so and so, and what's wrong with me? Why didn't I, foresee this? And then you get into a whole cycle of
Viral.
craziness. Yeah, and it's a spiral, and really letting go of that, and actually creating that practice for ourselves every day, and actually catching ourselves
Yeah.
when we're doing that is so important. And it's so interesting because of how you talk about the micro, because it's exactly that. If anything, it's actually shown us this last year, and upcoming as well, and continually as we speak, is this awareness of how little bit of movement of change that's gradual can create such an extraordinary long-term effect,
Hmm.
in the aggregate. That is actually a very different way from going at it from our usual kind of attitude towards achievement, and like, oh my God, I need to do this by this time. This has to be done. These goals have to be achieved. And it's a much more feminine approach, actually.
Hmm.
I would love to, talk about your work in the feminine, because it's so powerful and so apropos for these times.
It's interesting because so much of what I've learned is from war.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I'm realizing, which I never realized before, and it's an obvious thing, but in this moments of reflection, I really began to realize war in itself has its own culture. And people tend to almost react because, I think about like the sisterhoods I've built, and we joke that war zones are like dog years. So you spend 3 months, it's like you were there 3 years because of the intensity of it. And so, I have sisters in Nigeria, I have sisters in Malaysia, I have all, and I'm like, we're so different culturally, but what we shared was the experience of war. And we can almost predict our reactions because that in itself ended up having a cultural influence on us that I've never really put in. And part of it was the hypersensitivity. And, I'll give you the example, not only war of sanctions, like Iraqi women became legends in the region, under sanctions. Like they were throwing entire weddings with like, 2 pencils and a table or like something ridiculous because everything was banned from the country. And yet they refused not to celebrate moments of joy. Cake was illegal. You couldn't make cake using flour under sanctions. Like there were these secret bakeries that would make wedding, and sometimes, if there was an extreme birthday, like 57th birthday, like there was always a way. Like in Afghanistan, like women who were wearing the burqa, like their protest was wearing lipstick. No one could see it but them, So, the feminine in extreme environments always finds solutions. And that's what we have to benefit from. And they're always finding solutions with limited resources that feed the collective. And so, I do believe this is more dynamics of power than just gender. So there's
Hmm.
that element to add into the mix as well. They have less to lose. They're less targeted. They're more mobile. So there's actually advantages,
Hmm.
which then makes them targets. So there's, with every success, there's a new threat. So there's all these intertwinings. But what we know is that women tend to be able to do that. And then they also tend to be the holders of culture. So I'm sure, I don't have stories in America, but I find this in other conflicts, and I'm very confident if I were to go back to like South Carolina where I grew up and speak to some of the aunties, like their instincts are kicking in, whether it's the colonial history, whether it's the immigrant history, there's something that will kick in, and suddenly they're preserving more. They're, they're saving more. They're, if you go into an immigrant's home, like, and you open up the pantry, we're usually stocked for 3 months. Because of the pandemic, you're going to see that across America now. Like, there's just more of that preparation and stuff. And all of that comes from the collective memory of the feminine. They're the ones who tend to bring that back in times of need. And crisis isn't always war. Like, we've had hurricanes, we've had different elements. So you can actually see within the different states the resilience and the degrees. It's very, as a social anthropologist, which I've never studied, but I always joke there's one trapped inside me. It's really fascinating to watch as America responds, those who have tools and those who do not. And my hope is that we share more how to use those tools. So for example, one of the ambassadors for Let Love In works on poverty and feeding the homeless in Compton and in inner cities across LA.
Mm-hmm.
And the lessons that he has is just priceless for how to manage the pandemic. And he's now part of our community with Let Love In as an ambassador and sharing. So really going in, and like that's where my mind goes, is who naturally has resilience, who's had it for decades, and how do we bring them in to share it with those who do not. So it's not just war, it's just those circumstances that force you into innovation and
Right.
creativity. And I'm trying to bring us back. And you know what I love is like almost everyone that I know that does this work, we all do it laughing and dancing. Like that's kind of our thing, is like when the sand starts to shift, you can either stand still or drown, or you can dance, and we always choose to
Yes.
dance.
Amazing. Amazing. And I mean, it harks back to actually what you said earlier in the podcast, which was about how the process, having gone through intense periods of war, and how there's so many similarities in the peace process with, the peace building process with the war process as well. It's kind of two sides of the same coin. And with that intensity, it's it's almost as if the experience accumulated in those kind of desperate times where you absolutely need resilience or you will die,
Mhm.
how that and bringing that into an acceleration of the process of peace or the process of reconciliation or bridge building, right?
Mhm.
And that, you mentioned Let Love In campaign, which is actually so beautiful, and I would love to have you share more about that with all of us, because it is such a simple and yet beautiful way for us to activate that essence within us, that heart opening place within us, so that we can actually make it contagious.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's almost as simple as just reminding people why they wake up in the morning.
So
You
what
know,
is the
again,
Let
we're
Love In campaign actually?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the Let Love In campaign is very much what we were talking about how to get people into heart space. And
Mhm.
and it came, a lot of what I've created comes from my own personal journeys of pain. And in the middle of the pandemic, I just had this moment of thinking I wasn't going to make it, and I was. I've worked all these years. I've built this company. I've built all these tools, and it was just this, temptation to in the face of the pandemic, and the face of, a cyber attack I was under, and in the face of Trump and everything else, being really tied to foreign policy, it was a real temptation to put on my armor, like to put it back
Mhm.
on. And I had spent so many years taking it off, but I was like, okay, wait a minute, this is pandemic, this is real, there's all these, very real threats. I need my armor. This is a legitimate reason. And I stopped and said, well, what if I tried something different? What if I, rather than put on the armor, I've never been a big of a sword girl, but I've always carried my shield. So, like, what if I actually refused to pick it up, kept the armor off, and let love in as a way of defending myself? So not only in the good moment, what if I actually let love be my shield? And it worked. And I just was like, this is amazing. And so I wanted to share it. And I invited people I know who were struggling and being like, what do you love? Let's create videos. And it was supposed to be one video. So, like, all of this was going in collaboration with the Peace Studio, who had invited me to contribute as one of their piece artists. And then once we finished the first video, we couldn't stop. And then we started inviting people. And initially it was a US initiative, but I was getting videos from Malaysia, from Costa Rica, from the UK, and from a lot from Dubai. And I was like, all right, let's keep this going. So we continued, and we're doing the Let Love In campaign, and we hope to follow it in a partnership for a pledge to listen. So after you have heart space, after you remember what you love, you remember why you wake up in the morning, then hopefully you're in a place to listen. So that would be the next step. And, I really believe we have to bring, people along the journey. You can't just jump to the end of that, again, that difficult conversation or that dialogue or that brave conversation. No, you've got to be aligned and in that heart space to do that. And so I'm hoping to leave breadcrumbs to remind people how they get back to a place of love. And it's been amazing. I love it because, it's so fun to see different people's interpretation of love. Like some of them look like hard work to me and it's love. And some of it looks probably silly to others, but that's my love. And I just love seeing the different versions of how everyone lets it in.
And that's a beautiful way to connect right there, is to
Yeah.
see how other people do it. And you're like, oh, I didn't know. And then think of that could be actually fun.
Yeah,
So
totally.
it's so true. And I love the beautiful sort of tagline of what Let Love In is all about, which is really about joy, love, and pleasure, and how those three are foundational for life. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of we were having this chat the other night about how especially in the spiritual community, there's such this old paradigm idea of suffering in order to attain particular level of enlightenment or wisdom. And okay, yes, that's often true. However, we are also moving into an era and a time now as we continue to evolve, because then what's the point if we're not actually evolving? So here we are collectively. And so that actually activating those high vibrations of joy and love and heart open space and compassion and pleasure is paramount for us to actually continue to move ourselves forward in
Yeah.
embodiment. We're so used to either thinking we're doing, busy, or we're kind of concepting, right? We're thinking. And then there's a missing process in between, which is that coming into the heart space, which actually adds that crucial element of intelligence and of insight and wisdom that might have been missed if we just kind of went, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have these 5 steps I need to do. Boom, 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 boom. I do it. Okay, yeah, I've done it. But is the result actually, reflective of what I intended in the first place? It's because
Yeah.
that embodiment missing piece is actually how we move forward. So
Absolutely.
there is no skipping that level. And so back to the individual, right? Because we can only start from ourselves, is those are the basic building blocks. If, we can think all day long, we want a better world, but until we start embodying it and reminding ourselves and actually creating those habits, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it continuously strikes me with the women I work with and in almost every retreat how much they need permission to get
Mm,
to pleasure and joy. It's like, when and this is why I work through sacred texts and through religion, is like,
mhm,
my word. And in some cases, like the science, all the self-help, the well-being, it's not strong enough, right? That story of sacrifice and suffering builds character, especially for women. That story of this world is the test and the afterlife is the reward.
mhm.
It's such a strong story fed with energy of thousands of years. It's really hard to deconstruct. So the only thing that I find where people will pause is when I'm quoting scripture. And there's plenty of scripture to quote because, most religions will say, like, this is the key. This is the breadcrumb to know where to go. This is how you know
Right.
you're on track, is the joy, is the pleasure. But a lot of religions have stopped the teachings from that perspective. So there's a whole
Yes.
revivalism that has to go on to be like, look, this is a reminder. I mean, one of the verses or one of the sayings of the prophet, like that seems, again, bumper sticker, but holds infinite wisdom, is to know yourself is to know God.
Mhm.
And, I always just took that as like you follow the rules and then you're closer to God. But now I understand we are actually the blueprint and the secret key to understanding the divine. And at the same time, when you have outside pressure and outside forces and they come in the form of thought, when you know yourself, it's not yours and you can push it back. I mean, it's the ultimate strength. And so I'm like, how is this one verse that has been interpreted as follow the rules rigidly actually the key to freedom? And so that's a lot of what I play with the retreats, is deconstructing what's actually there and being able to see the depth of the wisdom beyond the surface interpretation. And it's amazing because you just see light bulbs go off, like people who are arguing and like, this is insane, and Manal, I can't believe that you're saying this and all this that's going on in our community, and you want me to think about what brings me joy. I've got 10 kids that I'm trying to figure out how to put through school, and you're telling me what's my pleasure routine. And then with 1 or 2 verses, boom, the light bulb goes off and they realize this is the tool to figure out how to get the 10
Hmm.
kids through college, right? It's the
Right.
tool to do it where they're not feeling so guilty, and that energy of then feeling indebted to their, like, there's a whole different energy that comes, and like they're getting it and they're absorbing it and they're excited about it because it's not replacing their to-do list, it's easing their to-do list. But it takes a lot of time to get them there. Like, it's argument after argument after argument until they finally get to the point and be like, oh, okay, we see it. So I
Hmm.
always find it so fascinating at how the strong resistance built into those words. And the other thing is, I have people come back with these wild imaginations of like very scandalous retreats and parties when they hear pleasure. And it's fascinating to me that despite the emphasis on spirit and sacredness, because I talk about sexuality, people go there. So it's
Right.
really, really interesting to kind of see that interaction, and it helps me understand like where the community is. And we're very far from accepting these tools.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about millennia of suppression of sexuality, of women's sexuality in particular, by all
Yeah.
religions, and yet for all religions, we're talking about Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and just to name
Yeah.
the bigger ones, and Buddhism. There's
Yeah.
totally that other aspects which has to do with body and pleasure, and you can find those texts. It's just that they've been selectively kind of pushed out or not really emphasized or not taught, and
Yeah.
it's fascinating actually. And
Yeah. And
you know
it is really just within the patriarchal system, right? Like,
right,
that's
exactly,
when all this divide came, and it's because it's so heavily embedded on a reward and punishment model, so
absolutely.
there has to be clear bad guys. And and actually, as I say that, it makes me also worry because I feel like these days we use psychological terms to identify bad people and not just the old religious terms, but you see that need to create villains. And I feel like
Right.
that's a great way for the ego to distract itself from the real work. It's just like really
Which is
staying
just your own
present.
work. Yeah,
Yeah.
staying present and holding space. And
Yeah.
it's ironic because, and I always find it difficult to, because it's about holding both polarities, because we
Yeah.
are both. There's no such thing as completely purely good or evil or light or dark. Every
Absolutely.
piece has every group, whatever polarity, there exists the opposite within it. So
Absolutely.
I mean, just look at the yin and yang symbol. There's always a
Absolutely.
little bit black dot within the white, a little white dot within the black, and that's
Yeah.
exactly why.
Yeah.
So
And I
yeah.
think that, and it's what I emphasize a lot in terms of like that concept of purity. It's like, we're not made to be angels. We didn't
Oh,
come down as prophets. Like, the human experience is a messy experience. And the more people hear that, this goes back to making people feel safe and validated. It brings down the nervous system. It brings down the mind's need to think of defenses. Like,
mhm,
you're able to recognize, okay, this is a very natural state that I'm in. As angry or as violent as it may appear, I always believe there's a legitimate grievous deep down. Like, we're ignoring the psychopaths and
absolutely.
the other extremes, but when you go deep, deep down into humanity, there's usually a legitimate grievance that tons of stories got piled on top of. So
Mhm,
you have to
mhm.
deconstruct the stories and get to that root.
And what's interesting is often that there's no shortcut per se, but there's a very efficient way of getting to someone's heart,
Hmm.
is actually connecting to joy
Yeah.
and love
Yeah.
and pleasure. So whether it's a great
Absolutely.
meal, which is how I like to connect with people, is over a great meal, or whether it's, being having a heart to heart with a friend, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's,
Absolutely.
it's so powerful just doing that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
and what is your favorite way to connect, actually?
So for me, it is like, I feel like I was really serious as a kid.
Hmm.
And like, one of the, like I was saying, like the obligation phase of like, I've got to figure this whole thing out. And like, really, really, there was points in my time where like, I think I was in high school, like figuring out world peace and really thinking, I like, if we do this, if we do that, like, that type of stuff. So when I want to get into heart space these days, I connect with the little girl and let her play, because I feel like
Hmm.
I denied her a lot of play. And so like when I was a kid, I like loved imagination and like dancing and stuff like that. So it's a kind of my go-to now is like, okay, you didn't do enough of that as a kid. So like, let's go into a room and just like dance to your favorite songs and be silly and stuff. And I'll do that even in the middle of a working day. Like I'll usually take 15 minutes and just go and just be like, play an old school
Awesome.
song that I like and just really like, drop it low, get down, and then come back to work. And it just gets me in that high vibration place. So
Amazing. I mean, oh my God, I've been actually struggling a little bit because having been stuck indoors for so long. But I recently went out just 2 days ago, just drove out and was out in Westchester, just Westchester, which is suburbs, but it was just awesome to be out of the city and just having woods. And I went and literally hugged a tree for a
oh,
long time and just like, oh,
beautiful.
I'm so happy I'm gonna hug this tree.
That's
So it
awesome.
was it was pretty awesome. And what is it then? I'm very curious in terms of coming into your inner place of guidance. Is it your heart? Is that what guides you? How do you, what is your internal guidance system like?
It's interesting because like one of the last things I want to do is pretend like I figured it out, right? Like this is
Mhm.
still a work in progress. I would say I try to come into my heart, but because of the amount of hurt and loss, there's still a lot of work and communicating. Like I have to like it takes a lot more time than usual. So I've learned to trust like the sensations in my body as well. Because it's really funny when I dialogue with my heart, like how long to really get to a place where it feels safe enough to speak what it wants. But it'll like I have other signs, like the tension in my throat, I pay a lot of attention to, or like just where I hold my tension across my body. So I think it's like this double, like, while I'm building that relationship where I can get into my heart a lot easier, the rest of my body is really telling me. It's so funny. Like it'll come in the form of like tightness in the jaw or like my leg. And like if I really, really pay attention to it, I begin to realize, okay, this is the tension. I've been delaying this, da 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 da
Mhm.
da. So it's kind of my interim facilitator and as I get closer and closer into heart space. And I say that because for such a hurt and guarded heart, it does take time. And I think people think like, if I meditate, I'll drop into heart. And it's like that
Mm-mm.
trust
It's
for
fine.
me had to be built too, because in the past, I overrode my intuition so many times. I overrode what my heart wanted so many times that in some ways it's like I mistreated a really good best friend and now have to go back and remind it, no, I'm really in for the long run. And that's kind of still the process I've been in with like healing the heart in the last few years.
I totally hear you, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm going through the same process, and it's funny because our bodies never lie, right? So
Mhm.
for you, it comes maybe some tension in the neck. For me, it'll come like my back pain suddenly, or something in my eye, or something will pop up in my body where it's like, stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Pay attention.
Pay attention. And that's our pledge to listen, right? Speaking of pledge to listen, is we start
Beautiful.
from listening to our own body,
Yes.
and it's so powerful, and that is such a private experience. No one's applauding you along the way except our soul. It's like super psyched because we know, like, when we go through that process, um that it is transformational, and it does take practice. And again, back to what you were talking about earlier, which is compassion and patience, step at a time. Just start with very, very basic things, like how, catching yourself in those moments and starting to listen and go, okay, well, all right then, well, okay, if I shouldn't be doing this, should I be resting? Should I be taking a walk? What is it that then brings me joy? Let's do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they both feed each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Manal, if someone wanted to learn more about Across Red Lines and the work that you do, where can they go?
Yeah, I mean, one is, always feel free to email directly. It's ARL at acrossredlines.com. We have the website with all the information, which is again, acrossredlines.com. And then on there is the Let Love In campaign. We're on all the social media outlets. I'm pretty much always on social media. So if you DM or want to send messages, I'm pretty responsive. So that's the best way to connect.
Are you on, so on Instagram, for example, is it across red lines or is that a Manal
Across red
Omar?
lines. Yeah.
Okay,
So on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, it's all across red lines.
fantastic. And are you still doing retreats at the moment, like virtual ones?
I haven't done, I mean, the last one we did was, before the pandemic. I haven't done any during the pandemic, but right now we're looking at the retreat center that I'm currently at, finding like if there's a way to do rapid testing and how we would be able to create like a safe small container if it was possible. There's a possibility that I'll take some of the classes online. I've been talking to just a few people to make sure that everything is secure because it's such private information. So I wouldn't be able to use Zoom
Absolutely.
or something like that. So in the name of like privacy and security, I'm looking at alternative things to make sure that if we did do it online, it's very secure. Most of the information people share through these retreats are extremely private.
Fantastic. Thank you. And just it's just so amazing to have you as a guest and just to see how you're taking all the years of experience in the macro world and bringing it micro and then bringing it macro out into a new way of being in this new era. So thank you again, Manal. Thank you for being on
Thank
the
you
show.
so much for having me. And again, I always enjoy our conversation. So I'm really grateful to being on this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.